Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have so many of you with us here today for This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by Open Air to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act and other carbon removal policies that we have under development in New York and other US states, as well as around the world. Everyone, please feel free to introduce yourself in the Zoom chat and tell us where you're Zooming in from. My name's Toby Bryce. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy with Open Air. Quick background on Open Air: we're a distributed, open source, all volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon removal solutions that are essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing community, we collaborate on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy, research and development, and market development for carbon removal. Please join us. There should be a link in the chat to sign up for our Discord server, which is where we communicate and connect online. Quick background on carbon removal. We always like to define it and talk a little bit about it before we engage in these programs. Carbon removal, most of you are familiar, but carbon removal is the practice of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely and durably in the geosphere, the ocean, or in long-lived products. When considering carbon removal as we are today and with a series, it's essential first and foremost to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We must reduce global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, every credible climate forecast, including in very stark terms, the most recent IPCC assessment report, show that carbon removal will be required at gigaton scale. That's billions of tons per year by mid-century to counteract those the emissions that are difficult to abate, and ultimately to start removing the tremendous amount of excessive amount of anthropogenic carbon dioxide that we already have in the atmosphere, so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you want to learn more about CDR, there's an image right there of the Carbon Dioxide Removal Primer, which is a fantastic, basically a textbook on CDR that is a great place to start. We'll also put some links in the chat to some recently published materials from the Department of Energy as part of their CDR Earthshot program that are great, like summary overviews of CDR, all sorts of resources online and on Open Air's website, and we'll have a few more of those put in the chat. Also, I want to give you a quick overview of the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, which is the policy that we are talking about. It's a state-level CDR procurement policy that is intended to provide market support to scale durable carbon removal. It's standards-based and really centered on the idea of equity and environmental justice. It's been introduced into the New York Assembly by Assembly Member Patricia Fahey, who's a fantastic and powerful state legislator in New York based in Albany. It's got a bill number, A8597. We are also working to advance the policy in other states, including California, Washington, and a number of other states in North America. Need all the help we can get on the advocacy front. So again, please join Open Air and help us move this policy forward. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Megha, who will provide a little bit more information about the logistics for today and introduce our fantastic speakers.
Thanks, Toby. Hey, everyone. I'm Megha. I'm an Open Air member based out in London, but working on policy advocacy opportunities in California, where I'm from. The usual housekeeping notes that we have, our format will be a 15 to 20-minute presentation, followed by a few prepared questions, and then we'll do some moderated audience Q&A. So please type any questions that you have into Zoom's Q&A box as we go along. Note that that's separate from the chat function, so make sure you find the correct box. The event is being recorded, so we will send the video link out to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it to Open Air's website and to our YouTube channel. We'll also be live tweeting today's event, so the Twitter link, it should be in the chat already, and please follow along with that. If you do tweet, the event hashtag is #ThisIsCDR. And on to the main event. So we're very pleased to welcome Matt Kennedy and Josh Stolaroff from Mote to This Is CDR this week to present the company's wood waste to carbon negative hydrogen CDR pathway, which was recently funded by investors and will be opening a 150 kiloton carbon dioxide per year demonstration plant in Bakersfield, California in 2024. A quick intro to the presenters. So Matt is the CEO of Mote. He's an environmental lawyer with experience working in the US courts, the Senate, the House, EPA, DOE, and DOJ. And Josh is the CTO of Mote. He is an environmental engineer and helped to create the technology that became carbon engineering. He also helped to start and later run the CCS program at Lawrence Livermore National Labs. Mac and Josh, over to you.
Thanks so much, Megha. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Toby and Chris, for having us. Yeah, well, let's get started. We have an exciting presentation for you all. Excited to dig into this. So I'm Mac Kennedy, the CEO of a company called Mote, and we recycle wood waste to make hydrogen. So the United States can credibly get to net zero by 2045. And I love what you were saying, Toby, about it's not either or, it's not either carbon removal or emissions reductions, it's both. We need a lot of both to get to net zero. And there's a credible pathway to get there. So converting waste biomass can provide the majority of the carbon removal that we need. So this is based on the work that my co-founder Josh did at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, showing for California how it can hit net zero. And kind of all the proven carbon removal pathways they looked at, the bulk of carbon removal needed comes from waste biomass. We think there's strong evidence that this applies nationally and then across the globe. And of all the things you can do with waste biomass, it turns out on the fundamentals that gasifying the woody waste biomass into hydrogen has the best economics and the best impact on the environment. So in terms of the amount of emissions removed and the lowest cost per ton of CO2, it's hard to beat this pathway, and that's what got us really excited about this. So on hydrogen, it's already a very large market. Globally, it's already over 100 million tons produced every year. But to get to the emission reductions we need to get to net zero, this is going to have to scale rapidly. In any scenario in which we stay under 2 degrees Celsius of warming, this is going to have a massive ramp up in infrastructure, which we're hoping to help usher in. So today, hydrogen is mostly just used for producing ammonia, refining petroleum to make gasoline, and producing methanol, and then as for some other chemical feedstocks. So the way that the new hydrogen economy is being built out is anywhere that batteries don't make sense, you can kind of think that hydrogen will be the preferred energy carrier. So for heavy duty trucking, long haul rail, for energy storage, there's a lot of use cases that we're already seeing really ramp up right now. So almost all the hydrogen that is made today is from steam methane reforming, which is basically taking natural gas and stripping off the hydrogen from it, which, as you can imagine, is not really the best thing you could do for the environment and is really highly carbon intensive. It's inexpensive though, in a world where there's not a price on carbon. So in markets across the world, this is the preferred solution today. We really don't like talking about hydrogen in terms of colors, but what some people have called blue hydrogen, which is when you do carbon capture and storage on the traditional way of making hydrogen from steam methane reforming, it significantly lowers the carbon intensity if you're appropriately doing the carbon capture, and it's still relatively inexpensive. But our goal is to reduce the development of fossil fuels as much as possible, which has the other option of doing water electrolysis, which gets an even lower carbon intensity, but it's really expensive today, and there's some limitations on what you can do there. So you need really inexpensive renewable energy with a really high capacity factor. You're limited by water and having land for deploying renewables to power the water electrolysis. And then ultimately, it's just going to be a question of getting to innovation for better electrolyzers. But even there, we're still kind of limited in terms of how inexpensive electrolysis can get. So we need some more options on the table. So what we're doing at Mote is we are integrating proven component pieces of equipment to gasify wood waste and basically separate that syngas into hydrogen for use. And then the CO2, we are doing geologic storage and are eventually aiming to do CO2 utilization. So our company has two things that we do. We sell hydrogen, and then we also sell carbon removal. So initially, we're really playing in the hydrogen for transportation market, but I showed what those kind of future uses of hydrogen will look like, and we're excited about selling hydrogen as a chemical feedstock, using it for energy storage, heating, and for carbon removal. A lot of this is powered by the federal 45Q carbon capture tax credit. And on the state level, California's low carbon fuel standard is helping drive this a lot. And then we also have the voluntary market, which is helping start carbon removal generally. So the markets for renewable hydrogen and for carbon removal are both going to be trillion-dollar markets. No one knows exactly how many trillions of dollars that the total available market is, but we know it's that order. And since we have this really unique way of producing massive amounts of renewable hydrogen and carbon removal at billion-ton scale, we're hoping to really help kickstart the build out of the infrastructure needed for this scale. So I'm going to go slow on this slide, but you can see that what we're doing is, compared to electrolysis, we have a very similar production costs as electrolysis, but the hydrogen for us is really just kind of upside to our carbon removal business. So electrolysis is not carbon dioxide removal, so it has this one revenue stream and is ultimately a cost. But what we're doing is have a really inexpensive way of removing carbon from the atmosphere and having this hydrogen byproduct on top of that. So our economics are really competitive in terms of how you can produce renewable hydrogen. Compared to electrolysis, which emits a little bit of CO2, we're actively taking out carbon out of the air. So it's pretty favorable in the long term. So right now we're doing some engineering work with Fluor Corporation on the design for our first deployment. And we'll be finishing a pre-feed up in March. Really excited about that. And that'll help us support our pipeline of projects we have now. We're talking with Carbon Cure about potentially providing CO2 for beneficial use in their CO2 to concrete technologies. And then the core technology piece of equipment that we're using is Sungas Renewables Gasifier. So they are a subsidiary of Gas Technology Institute, and we're really excited to be working with them. So I wanted to kind of show this because I think a lot of people will be interested in kind of what our process looks like. So this is a slightly more detailed process flow diagram. So essentially, our input is woody biomass from the forest, from farms, from landfills. We dry and grind that, and then it goes to our gasifier. It's in an oxygen-controlled environment, so there's an air separation unit there, and then we are cleaning up the syngas that comes out of our gasifier. So basically, all of the biomass turns into a nice gas, which we can then clean up and process. So the kind of key reaction is the water gas shift reactor, turning the syngas into hydrogen, which we then clean up and purify, compress, liquefy. And then the CO2, we're drying and compressing that, and then can send that to CO2 pipe to be injected underground or to be utilized. So this is also a little more detail that I think is going to help answer some questions that I know some people will have. So this is kind of on the question of what do you do with woody biomass? So there's a reason that we've chosen this pathway, and we think it's the most economical and most scalable for what you do with Woody Biomass. So, compared to making gasoline or electricity, hydrogen is the most valuable thing you could be making, and it removes the most carbon from the wood waste, from the atmosphere. So you can see in the top right, it just makes sense in terms of the fundamentals. And so, whether we're compressing it or liquefying it, hydrogen is really the long-term play here, and that's what we're building our company around. And then the other question that'll come up is air pollution. So, there are some kind of gasification technologies out there that are using indirect gasification, where there's, some air pollution. What we're doing is direct gasification, where the only 3 products out of our system is ash and CO2 and hydrogen. So the ash does not go into the air. We're actually able to sell it as a fertilizer. So there's a robust market in California for selling the ash byproduct for beneficial use. And our criteria pollutants are virtually zero from our process. So we're really excited about that, and it's going to be a huge benefit to local air quality. And that is our presentation. So super excited to start going through some of these questions. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Mac. That was excellent. And we're going to start with a few prepared questions that we've sort of crowdsourced from our open air community. And then we're going to move to the audience questions. And so everyone, please keep the audience questions coming in. And if you can put those in the Zoom Q&A box, it makes it a lot easier for us to sort them and make sure that they get answered. Yeah, so let's start, maybe take a step back a little bit, Mac. We had very short bios for both you and Josh. And can you talk a little bit about your professional journey to carbon removal? And because, not everyone knows what carbon removal is, and how did you start working on it? And, where Mote came from, and maybe a little bit about, has the idea evolved from your initial conception of it to where you are now? Just give us a little kind of walkthrough of the journey there.
Yeah, definitely. So, my background is originally as an environmental lawyer. I kind of worked in every facet of environmental law in the federal government. And, I had a lot of fun doing that. But back in 2016, some of the political winds changed a little bit. And I realized that my prospective career in the federal government maybe was less rosy than I was expecting. And so it had me kind of look around for what I could really make an impact with in climate change. And the research that was coming out of Lawrence Livermore National Lab on their carbon removal technologies that they were developing was so intriguing to me. I started reading as much of their work as I could, going through all these papers. And initially, it's a really steep learning curve, not understanding every other word in these papers. But was so interested in the potential for carbon removal, and saw, that this was kind of the early days of something that could become as big as, electric vehicles or, renewable electricity. And so I reached out to Josh. This is the first person I contacted about carbon removal. And that was back in, I think, the very end of 2016. And I started asking him a bunch of dumb questions. And sure enough, I'm asking him a bunch of dumb questions today. But yeah, so I think for me, it was really just trying to get involved any way I could, and trying to find someone who would take a chance on me. And luckily that was Josh. And I think we really hit it off and kind of shared some of these same interests. And, but it took a long time before we could start this business in March of 2020. So definitely was, several years in the trenches of trying to figure out, what kind of thing we can really commercialize. And when Josh published Getting to Neutral, the real big finding there was in this report that this pathway just blew the rest out of the water, and it hadn't been done yet. So that got us really excited. And but that's a little bit about my kind of story to getting here. But I'll let Josh share his a little bit.
Yeah, Josh, how did you, from your sort of science background, when did you start thinking about carbon removal? And we're also huge fans of getting to neutral. And I think that link's either in the chat or we'll put it in the chat, but that's been a big inspiration for us as well at Open Air.
Yeah, sure. I've been in carbon removal a long time. I was fortunate to have an undergraduate advisor when I was at Berkeley, David Sedlak, who said, he knew that I was in environmental engineering and was interested in climate change. And he said, you know, you should look at this thing called carbon capture I've heard about recently. That was like in the year 1999. That led me to grad school at Carnegie Mellon, where I hooked up with David Keith, who was my graduate advisor. And then we did a PhD thesis on direct air capture. So I managed to build the first meter scale prototype for capturing CO2 from the air. That was during my PhD in like 2005.
Oh, wow.
And I've been in and around the field ever since. So I've always thought about carbon removal, did a lot of work on point source carbon capture while I was at Livermore for the last decade. But as the interest and resources for direct air capture and other forms of carbon removal kind of came back into prominence, that's a wave I've been riding since.
Got it. So you're a CDR OG, as we like to call them at Open Air. And where did the name Mote come from? I mean, it's obviously a word in the English language, but where did the name come from?
Honestly, I'm a huge fan of the author Jhumpa Lahiri, and it's a word that she likes to use a lot. I was reading Interpreter of Maladies, and it was kind of a crutch word that she kept falling back on, and I was like, I love this word. And I was living on Motor Avenue at the time, and we want to take motes of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it's not trademarked.
Yeah.
So we have that. Which
is key. You are the first mention of Jhumpa Lahiri on Open Air. This is CDR, and she's a great writer, so everyone look her up. One other question about your name, because originally you kind of went to market as Mote Hydrogen, and now you're kind of more Mote. And I don't want to load the question, but there was Roger Ains, who I know Josh works with or has worked with at Lawrence Livermore. He and some other folks came up with this new word for BECS, which is bioenergy carbon capture and storage, called BIKERS, which is biomass carbon removal and storage. And there's sort of a change of emphasis from the energy side to the carbon removal side. And can you talk a little bit about that? Is that reflective of the name change? And how do you think about that with respect to your business model? And like, you have 2 products or 3 products, really, if you include the ash byproduct, and like maybe carbon removal has assumed greater priority. And then I'm sorry, this ICEF, the Institute for Cool Earth Foundation, produced kind of a landmark BIKERS roadmap that we'll put in the chat maybe a year ago. That is also, I think, a really important document for this.
Yeah, so our name has been Mote, but we haven't been able to get the mote.com domain yet. So we thought Mote Hydrogen would be our kind of second best bet for now. But you hit it on the head there. With the biomass carbon removal and storage, or BIKERS term, which we really like, the emphasis definitely is not on the energy, it's definitely on the carbon removal. And that's reflective in our business. Most of our value is from removing carbon from the air, and the hydrogen is just this, great upside co-product, right? Where, incidentally, we're producing very high volumes of negative CI hydrogen. So it's, it makes our business stronger. But what we're really doing is taking CO2 out of the air.
Got it. Yeah, that's kind of how we think about it as well. I think BIKERS, we're team BIKERS as opposed to BECS. Although BECS is weirdly persistent in Europe, it seems. Quick question on the carbon removal side. Can you speak a little bit to the energy efficiency and the life cycle analysis of your process strictly on the carbon removal side? Obviously, your hydrogen is carbon negative because you're removing CO2, but if you just look at your process as a CDR pathway, can one of you guys talk a little bit about the efficiency there and how you think about the life cycle analysis?
Yeah, we ran some, so the life cycle analysis is important to our business model because we get credit for the carbon removed under the low carbon fuel standard. And that is what drives us to using waste biomass largely. We don't have to worry about the production emissions from energy crops, which other biofuels pathways get taken a big hit on. It's biomass that would otherwise decompose or sometimes go to the landfill and then emit methane. So that favors our life cycle analysis a lot. There's some emissions from transporting, but it's relatively minor. It's like less than 1% of the CO2 that we put underground goes to the trucking. So the main thing we have to worry about is there's some electricity used in our process. So emissions from making that electricity, if we can contract for renewable electricity, that helps. We can also work the system so that we make our own electricity in the plant. But our sort of baseline process is life cycle very favorable.
Great. Moving on a bit to the gasification process, you addressed some of this in the presentation, but I think that gasification, at least in some circles, has a bit of a bad reputation. There have been some problems from contaminant emission and environmental justice perspective with municipal waste gasification in the Northeast. Can you talk about a little more about how your process maybe avoids some of these issues? And I know Matt covered it a bit, but I think some of these things bear repeating, just given some of the questions about gasification. Just so for in terms of contaminants, how specifically does your process eliminate the possibility of contaminants being emitted into the atmosphere and affecting local communities? You know,
right.
With your capture of H2 and carbon dioxide.
Yeah, so with those concerns is a key distinction between direct and indirect gasifiers, which is why Max showed that slide in the end, because indirect gasifiers, which are more common, have a combustion element. And so like a power plant or like an incinerator, any other kind of combustion process, there's flue gas, there are particles and the associated air pollution, which you can add controls and limit. But using a direct gasifier as we do, you fundamentally change the air emissions profile, and it's actually very small.
Got it.
The larger amount of our air pollution for the plant that we're planning comes from just handling the wood in the wood yard, like the dust that blows off. So this process is very air pollution friendly, and we're taking, depending on where the biomass is coming from, if we're using like forest residues, then we're helping to prevent forest fires, which is good for the air. If we're using agricultural residues, we're preventing field burning, which again is good for the air. So we think our strategy is very friendly in those terms.
Great, that's good to hear. And then in terms of the purity of the resulting streams of the CO2 and the hydrogen, again, I've heard a little bit that some of the criticisms that it's difficult to get a pure stream of hydrogen from a gasification process. Is that also the same answer, like direct versus indirect, or are there specific things that you're doing to get a pure stream of resulting of hydrogen and CO2?
We get them both to what we like to call 4 nines. So 99.99% purity on both of those products.
Got it. And so you do have the ability to generate food grade CO2, for example, if that is where the market where you would need to send the CO2.
Yeah, that would be super cool.
Cool. All right. One more two-part question from us, and then we're getting a great volume of audience Q&A. So please keep those coming, and it's great to see. The fact that you guys are really concretely talking about 150,000 ton plant from a removal capacity perspective in as soon as 2024 is, I think, super exciting to everyone, and particularly us at Open Air, just because the carbon removal sector is so supply constrained. So if you're really able to bring those tons to market in 2 or 3 years, that is fantastic. Can you talk a little bit about the concrete things that need to happen between now and like starting to deliver tons, just from a not even from a, well, maybe partly technology, but also process like permitting, building? What are the things that the company needs to do? Because, you you guys haven't built plants before. So like how does this happen?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing ahead of us right now is, we're in the process of getting towards our first CO2 storage agreement. So our strategy is to work with CO2 storage developers. In the Kern County, Central Valley area, there's a couple of these projects underway. So we're looking at which project we're going to first work with to partner with, to co-locate our first project site with. So that's kind of the first thing on our list. Some of those projects are already some ways away along in the permitting process. So getting a Class 6 EPA injection well permit is kind of the longest lead item. But of course, in California, we have the California Environmental Quality Act, which is, kind of thorny. So for us, it's really getting this, as soon as we have a CO2 storage agreement, which is a brand new business, by the way, no one has ever just done CO2 storage as a service. So, we're figuring this out as we go. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned in how to do these contracts going forward. But once we have our first site picked out, we're going to start the site-specific engineering and design, and then as soon as we have the hydrogen accounted for in terms of our offtake agreements, we'll go to our project level investors to put up the capital to start the detailed engineering and construction. And then we'll be able to commission the plant and start producing molecules and putting the CO2 underground.
Got it. Yeah, the plant is the plant piece is the part that just like building plants is kind of it just seems a big lift. So it'll be exciting to watch how that happens. Just a question alongside. So last week we had a really great session on This Is CDR with Professor Holly Jean Buck, who is an expert on carbon removal and environmental justice and equity considerations relating to carbon removal. And maybe Chris can put that link in the chat. But she really stressed the importance of engaging with the local community up front. I mean, even if your process does not have any issues in terms of emissions, what are your thoughts about, I know that there's a very robust, let's call it environmental justice community in California, particularly the Central Valley. What are your plans for how you might engage with the local community and the timing of that? Like, how are you going to make that happen? Because I think that's a really, I think it's pretty important, just pragmatically speaking, to like address potential opposition to your plans, but it's also, I think, kind of morally speaking, the right way for the carbon removal sector to move forward in kind of antithesis to the way the fossil economy was built.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Toby. We don't want to, build something and then go to the community and say, hey, what do you all think about it? We want to involve the community from the beginning stages, right? So, you don't want to just put something in someone's backyard and say, hope you like it. We want to make sure that the community is engaged from the beginning of this process. We technically haven't announced any projects yet. And I think at the very beginning stages of this, before we even announce a project, we're engaging the community and, we're working closely with the different kind of regulators at the local level, and making sure that we involve the community in the planning process and figuring out how to minimize any or work with any concerns that they have, minimize any impact we're having to the community, and making sure it's a win-win for everyone. So I really like how you frame that, and definitely we share your kind of approach to getting the community involved to help us figure out how to make this as big of a win for them as it is for the atmosphere.
Great, that's a great answer. I think pretty much everyone in the carbon removal sector wants to do the right thing, and it's just hard to figure out exactly how to do it and what the process is. So it sounds like you guys are really thinking about it in a positive way. So thank you for that. I could continue to ask questions all day, but we have literally dozens of audience questions, and Megha is going to come on and start pulling those and putting those to you guys. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah, so we have quite a few. I'll try to get through them. So the first one we had was just asking about the colors of hydrogen. I know you mentioned blue, and you said that you guys try to stay away from kind of that classification system, but could you just talk a little bit about what that means and why you prefer to think about it differently?
Yeah, definitely. So what we really like to talk about is the carbon intensity. California has a what's called a GREET model, which is an acronym, GREET. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's basically California's system for kind of measuring the carbon intensity of fuels that are sold in California. So the unit of measurement that we're looking at is right here. So grams of CO2 per megajoule of energy. So basically the way that all hydrogen comes today is really carbon intensive. You're basically just like, flaring natural gas. So for every megajoule of energy you're producing, it's 160 grams of CO2. If you go to blue hydrogen, where you're adding on carbon capture, you reduce it quite a bit, almost to where it gets carbon neutral. And then if you're doing, if you're plugging electricity into water to do electrolysis of water, which has sometimes been called green hydrogen, it's also a little bit closer to carbon neutral as well. So, pretty close to a carbon-free way. If you're using 100% renewable electricity, you can get pretty close to carbon neutral. What we're doing, on the other hand, is carbon negative. So if you see on the right here, it's negative 150 grams of CO2 per megajoule of hydrogen that we're producing. So, we really like to make this a lot clearer and talk about what the grams of CO2 per megajoule is, the carbon intensity of the process, because that's where you can really see the life cycle assessment and what your net effect is. So, long term, we see ourselves really compatible with electrolysis of water, and there's going to be a lot of cases where it makes sense. But if we're anywhere in the vicinity of where we can send our hydrogen, our customers are going to prefer that because it's a more competitive option in terms of what price we can deliver it to our customers.
Got it. Makes sense. And I mean, yeah, you mentioned life cycle analysis, and we had a couple of questions about that. I know you talked about it a bit, but I think specifically people had questions on sort of the transportation aspect of it. And, are you able to locate your processing plants near the storage sites and near where the wood chips will come from, or is that going to vary just based on sort of the way you scale up over time?
So I'll start with these first couple of projects, and then I'll let Josh talk about kind of the expansion story. But there's a reason we're starting in the California Central Valley, the Kern County area. I definitely recommend driving out there. It's really pretty insane to see for the first time. But you go out to some of these, as you're driving past these square miles of orchards of almond trees and citrus trees, there's these things called wood yards, which have hundreds of thousands of tons of chipped up wood. So, for all these farmers out there, the trees only have a productive life of, 25 years roughly. So at the end of that life, they have to cut down the trees and wood chip them. There's nowhere to take that wood now. So it's just decomposing. And so that's really kind of what we're doing now. And fortunately, there's so much CO2 storage development underway just nearby, a couple of miles away from where all these wood yards are. So we're able to, take that wood waste and truck it a very short distance to where these CO2 storage projects will be, where we're going to co-locate our hydrogen production facility, our carbon removal facility. And so it's this really great narrative. And then the LA basin, just a couple, 150 miles away, has this really booming market for renewable hydrogen. So it's this really great story for the first couple of these projects. And, it's a great kind of beachhead. But Josh, do you want to speak to kind of expanding from there and kind of what the transportation questions look like?
Sure. Yeah, the kind of plant that we want to build is economically, it makes a lot of sense. And it's very competitive with other types of carbon removal, but it does require that you have a few things in one place. You got to have a source of waste biomass, a CO2 storage site, and a market for hydrogen. And California is not the only place in the US where we have all those things. So there are other places we can go. But it definitely expands the possibilities as the market matures and you can build pipelines. CO2 pipelines and hydrogen pipelines really open up the siting possibilities. But in the meantime, yeah, we have to truck things or rail things, and there's a limited radius, a couple of 100 miles, where you can piece together those factors. But one thing that we have going for us, and this goes back to our discussion, the distinction between BECs and bikers. When you think of biomass as an energy carrier, it is hard to move it very far and make a project work. And a lot of people have this sense that like, you can't transport biomass and have a viable project more than 40 miles or something like that. And because biomass is not a great energy carrier compared to fossil fuels, that's true, but it's a great carbon carrier. So when you're doing carbon removal, actually, it relaxes your constraints on transport a lot. And that gives us a lot of flexibility in siting just because biomass is more valuable to us because we're doing carbon removal and making hydrogen.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Okay, and then I guess kind of in the same vein, we had questions on, to what extent existing infrastructure can be used, I guess, in transportation primarily, but also anything else, since, that's relatively short distances we're talking about.
Yeah, how about you take this, Josh?
Yeah, the question is, where else can hydrogen be used?
I think it was more just like what kind of infrastructure, if any, can be reused that's already out there. So whether it's pipelines or anything.
Yeah, so it's a little bit challenging because people like to say hydrogen is a small molecule and it likes to escape. So in principle, you can use like natural gas pipelines for hydrogen, but there's some technical questions about what you have to do to be able to repurpose them. You can put some hydrogen into a natural gas pipeline and co-flow it, but there are questions about how much. And California utilities are struggling with that question right now because they need to decarbonize. But I think, there needs to be more research on that issue, but there is potential for reusing pipeline infrastructure. If nothing else, the rights of way. You can use the rights of way for CO2 and hydrogen pipelines.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. We had a couple of questions about, I guess, essentially the opportunity cost of doing something like this. So, given that trees are a carbon store and sort of can draw down more carbon, if you're thinking about taking biomass and using it in these processes, is there sort of like an afforestation plan that goes alongside it? Or how do you think about the overall effects of like sort of converting this into, feed materials for your process and the land use change that entails?
Yeah, we don't advocate like purpose-grown crops for this process because there is so much waste biomass out there right now that we can use. The agricultural residues, that forest management residues are things like we need to do fire management in California and a lot of the West, and that requires removing brush and small trees from the forest. So I don't think there's an opportunity cost for that. I mean, the opportunity cost is what else would you do with that waste biomass? And we think this is the best thing to do with it. But in terms of like the land use, there's not an issue there when we're using waste.
Okay.
If we're wildly successful and we're making 500 million tons of carbon removal and we're using all of the waste biomass in the US, then I think we start to look at energy crops and consider, but at this point,
yeah,
not where we're going.
Yeah, and do you see that having an impact on like soil health or anything else downstream, or does that not really play a role?
There are some cases where, I guess with corn stover, there's a conversation around how much can you take away from the field versus leave there. With orchard tree waste and almond shells and a lot of the things that we're focused on at the moment. There's not a soil health issue that we're aware of. And we can return a bunch of those nutrients, or a bunch of the minerals anyway, in the form of ash back to soils. So I don't see that as being a strong issue with our process.
Okay. We had a question about just, I think this is quite particular to California, but someone asked, can you get a reduced LCFS CI score for hydrogen based on carbon removal and get 45Q tax credits as well?
You want to take that, Mac?
I've been answering all this stuff in the comments. I'm sorry. Can you ask one more time?
Yeah, the question was just, can you get a reduced LCFS score for hydrogen based on carbon removal and get 45Q tax credits as well?
So
yeah, you can.
Short answer. Was there anything you wanted to add to that? I could move on if not.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right. Someone else asked, your first plant is just getting started in Bakersfield. Do you kind of already have thoughts on where the second plants would be and like where that kind of opportunity comes together with the right, siting and the right materials and everything kind of co-located in the right way?
Yeah, I mean, we have a pipeline of, more than 5 projects already. So, which we could all build in the same area. So it's merely just a question of us, getting up and going. We just closed a seed round and we're, already putting together our plans for, our next round of funding to scale this, since we have this, pipeline we really need to support and deploy past there. Goes back to our kind of core strategy, which is, what we're doing is deployable by design, from the start. Super exciting to see it, validated, and excited to build the next, 5 of these.
Yeah, actually another question we had was, if this is your, this is kind of the first commercial scale plant you guys are building, how did you guys kind of work up to that? Have you done a lot of pilot demonstrations, or what were the sort of first steps in there?
So one of the kind of first insights that Josh shared with me is that all of the component pieces of equipment to do this exist. They've been, out in the market for, decades, millions of operating hours. So kind of what we're doing is taking, this TRL9 plus commercial equipment and repurposing it in this novel process flow. And what we do to differentiate ourselves is create these system integration technologies that we've been developing on how all of those component pieces of equipment are going together. So, our strategy, doesn't depend upon, lab scale up approach. We're kind of going with all validated pieces of equipment that are, that project investors can feel really confident putting money behind.
Got it. Yeah. On kind of the economic side, do you see yourself selling carbon credits directly to entities, or would you go through marketplaces? That's something you've already kind of looked into.
Yeah, we really like what the voluntary carbon removal market is doing, and we want to figure out how to integrate it into there. That said, there are some benefits to the California low carbon fuel standard initially, for being able to, provide, 150 kiloton scale, and pay us, so much per ton of CO2. So, there's going to be some kind of, I think, marriage between, the compliance and voluntary markets, and things will level out ultimately probably around $100 per ton of CO2, which will allow us to, do carbon removal anywhere. So it's a mixture of both, I think.
Okay. Also on the economic side, could you just talk through like what are kind of the biggest costs in this, and what are going to be the most important things to like really scale it up, bring costs down, and kind of make it as economical as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, our core equipment that we're using is the gasification. And I think, the biggest kind of improvements we're going to get are from, the learnings from multiple deployments, kind of modularizing our approach. And I think the kind of, the more technologies that we develop, I think will get us even better there. But yeah, I think it's gonna, as our system matures, I think that's where we're gonna get a lot of CapEx and OpEx reductions.
Yeah, makes sense. We had a specific question, but maybe you could give a broader answer, which is, does the decomposition of wood waste stored in the wood yards generate any unwanted methane? But maybe you could talk more generally also about just like other kind of side effects or side products that might come out of this process and how you're sort of testing for and mitigating anything else like that.
Methane from the wood piles shouldn't be an issue if they're well managed, which ours will be. They won't go anaerobic. But in the, I guess, broader ecosystem where biomass is stored, that's something that we should keep an eye on. We think that there is an issue with the way, if you don't gather biomass from the forest floor, or if you put it in piles and leave it there, that there's some methane emissions in those cases. But there's actually little research on that, and it's kind of an open question right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. You talked a bit about modularity, and someone actually asked, do you ever foresee kind of like some kind of home appliance which uses your technology for a small micro scale, wood hydrogen production, or like how small are you thinking on the modular units that you might be able to produce one day?
Well, I'll just say first, Josh, that, gasification wants to be big, and that's, kind of by design, but Josh, please add on to that.
Yeah, I mean, that when you're doing carbon removal, unfortunately, a lot of people get excited about modular and home-based and various size scales, but for geologic storage of CO2, that also needs to be big. Our plant at 150,000 tons a year is actually pretty small for a geologic storage project. And as we move toward the next, plant number 2, 3, 4, they'll be bigger. So it's pretty hard to modularize when you need to collect and store the CO2 underground in a well that wants to be 1 million tons a year.
Right.
And then gasification equipment also, there's capital advantages to being big. So yeah, we can put the plant together in modular pieces, but the ultimate plant is going to be pretty big.
Makes sense. Yeah. Cool. I'm just going to ask one last question before I hand this back to Toby. So obviously, from the open air side, a lot of this is inspired by this policy CDR that we've been working on. Could you just talk about kind of the role that you think policy has to play in, making your companies like yours a success, and what it's really going to take to make this process, successful and scalable on a policy level?
I love this. We have a wish list ready to go.
Excellent. Let's hear it.
Man, if we had a federal low carbon fuel standard, chef's kiss.
All right.
The US EPA Class 6 permitting process, we're hopeful that EPA can even be staffed, that office can be staffed enough to do their job. It's a very tough job, and they're definitely understaffed. So we're hopeful that that's definitely kind of a long lead item, and everyone is talking about that. And then I think aside from just Class 6, I think to really deploy quickly to hit billion-ton scale, there just needs to be like kind of a streamlined regulatory process for carbon removal projects generally. And so I think from how states are supporting that, there's a lot of different ways, I think. Fortunately, we were getting a lot of support from the local and state level. But it's very new. So I think people are trying to figure out how this process is going to work. And
yeah,
it's new though.
Totally. Great, you guys, thank you so much. This was super interesting for me. I really enjoyed the presentation and everything, all the answers from the questions. So awesome, thank you for being here. And I'm gonna hand it back to Toby now to just talk about next week and what's coming next on This Is CDR. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Megha.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megha. And thank you everyone for such great and incisive audience questions. We really appreciate it. It makes the program what it is. And thank you to Mac and Josh for being with us. That was super fascinating. And again, we are amazingly excited to be watching you guys as a company that is actively deploying at such scale. So good luck, and we are with you. Do you mind unsharing your screen so that I can share the slide? Thank you. Just a quick note about what we have coming up. We mentioned this in the chat, but Mac's last answer about the legal and regulatory issues that that companies like Mote are facing are exactly the topic of what we're going to be talking. What we're going to be doing next week on This Is CDR. One of the nation's leading CDR law experts, Will Burns, who is now with Northwestern University, will be with us. So please tune in for that. It's really important, and you know, particularly on the regulatory side and the standards side. I mean, that's one of the things that in permitting, that's one of the things that's really like an obstacle for CDR deployment. So I think that'll be super interesting. The 8th, we have a team from Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, architecture firm, to talk about Urban Sequoia, which is a vision they presented, this really tremendous, futuristic, fantastical vision that they presented of the built environment as one large carbon sink, and super inspiring, and kind of like where we might be in 2100. We like to kind of have this positive forward-looking viewpoint. So they'll be with us on the 8th. And then one of the most exciting direct air capture companies out there, Airling, will be with us on the 15th to talk about their direct air capture process that leverages and enhances naturally occurring mineralization processes to take CO2 from the atmosphere. So super excited about that. We have a number of other programs that we're going to be announcing soon. So please stay tuned. Follow us on Twitter. Thank you again to Mac and Josh for presenting today. And thank you to all of you who joined us for being with us. See you next week. Thanks a lot.